In 1963, the BBC began to develop a new children's series for television. They hired composer Ron Grainer to write the theme tune for the new science fiction series. Grainer wanted an unusual sound, something edgy and unearthly. He visited the Radiophonic Workshop, a BBC department that created sound effects and music. There, Grainer met the studio assistant, Delia Derbyshire, and gave her his famously brief notes, probably containing a musical bass line and words like clouds, wind and bubbles. And then he went on holidays. With her colleagues, Delia worked night and day on the project, and when Grainer returned from holidays 2 weeks later, this is what he heard. Doctor Who was first broadcast on BBC in November 1963. When Ron Grainer heard this realisation of his idea, he said, "Did I really write that?" "Most of it," said Delia Derbyshire. Doctor Who was one of the first television series in the world to have a theme tune realised entirely by electronic means, and Delia's arrangement was used on the weekly broadcast for nearly 20 years, until 1980. Delia Derbyshire was born in Coventry, England, in 1937. As a child, she played piano and violin. For her A-levels, she took mathematics, physics, and theoretical mechanics. She graduated from Cambridge University in 1959 with an MA in maths and music. She applied for a job at Decca Records, but was famously told that they did not employ women in their studios. But she soon got a job at the BBC as a trainee assistant studio manager. In 1962, Delia moved into a relatively new department, the Radiophonic Workshop, which had been set up to provide non-realistic music and sound effects for radio and television. She brought with her mathematical qualification and musical ability. And shortly after she began working at the Radiophonic Workshop, Ron Grainer arrived with his ideas for the Doctor Who theme tune. Synthesizers were not available until the late 1960s, so just how did Delia create the Doctor Who theme tune? She was not interested in recording conventional instruments or using music and sound effects in a traditional way, so before she began, Derbyshire, her colleague Brian Hodgson and studio assistant Dick Mills went about creating a whole new orchestra of sounds. They plucked piano strings, knocked tin cans or tapped together different types of wood. They also used old test equipment from other BBC departments, which produced tones. Any time a sound was produced, it was recorded onto tape. At the end of this process, they had a certain reservoir of musical notes. To add to that, they repitched those notes by adjusting playback speed on the tape recorder. They could speed it up, thereby creating one note, or slow it down, creating another. When each sound was recorded onto tape, the tape was trimmed to the exact length of the note. Eventually, Delia had an entire orchestra of individual notes, represented by hundreds of thousands of tiny pieces of tape, each one handcrafted in the most exquisite way. With this palette of notes, Delia began to create the lines in the music, for example, the bass line, first melody, and so on. Each tiny piece of tape was stuck to the next tiny piece of tape with sticky tape. The notes had to be stuck together in the correct order and tempo. Eventually, she had a long loop of tape with edits every inch or so, which, when played on the tape machine, gave, for example, the bass line of the tune. This was done for each line. Then the lines had to be mixed together to create the overall sound we've just heard. Doctor Who marked the beginning of what became known as the golden age of the Radiophonic Workshop, and Delia Derbyshire began composing in earnest for radio and television. She was called on to compose where an orchestra would be out of place, programmes set in the distant past, or the unseen future, or deep within the human psyche. Blue Veils and Golden Sands was used to accompany a television series about the Tuareg tribe on the Sahara Desert. Apart from how atmospheric, how absolutely beautiful this piece is, it is as remarkable for how it was created. If we listen to a piano, we can recognise it as such. With the extraordinary music of Delia Derbyshire, the instrument is completely obscured. We don't quite know what we're listening to. For this composition, Delia rubbed an old tin lampshade until it vibrated, creating a note. She recorded that sound and adjusted the harmonics within the note so that the note remains constant but seems to shimmer internally. Between 1964 and 1972, Delia Derbyshire began taking on other projects outside the BBC, film, live events and theatre. She worked with Yoko Ono, Paul McCartney, Orson Welles, Peter Hall and Brian Epstein. In 1970, with Brian Hodgson, Delia worked for RTE on a radio production of Macbeth, produced by P.P. Maguire. Delia had collaborated successfully with Brian Hodgson in the BBC Radiophonic workshop, and the next logical step was to work for themselves. Hodgson took early retirement from the BBC and invested his money in a state-of-the-art studio. This ought to have been the start of a new life for both of them, but especially for her as a composer. But Delia had just broken up from a traumatic and destructive relationship. She was drinking heavily, and she was probably exhausted. And, in what seems like an attempt to escape from her life in London, instead of joining Hodgson, she took a job with a gas company in the north of England. She married briefly and separated. She lived with a Chinese artist for a few years in Cumbria. In 1978, she met Clive Blackburn, with whom she spent the rest of her life. Delia's return to public life came a full 20 years later. Composer Mark Ayres asked Delia to attend a Doctor Who convention. She did some radio interviews, including one for BBC Radio Scotland and one for BBC Women's Hour. She began some musical collaboration with recording artist Sonic Boom. Later, Mark Ayres began preparing a multimedia event called Generic Sci-Fi Quarry. Ayres asked her to contribute, but Delia Derbyshire passed away in July 2001, prior to the event. Crucially though, the question remains, why is the name Delia Derbyshire still largely unknown? Is it because of the attitude to electronic music at the time? Is it because the powerful BBC Musicians Union detached themselves from the new music, leaving the Radiophonic workshop employees in a creative and legal loophole? Or is it because Delia Derbyshire literally disappeared when she left the BBC in 1972? Whatever the reason, and there is surely more than one, she was caught in the crossfire of old and new music and has fallen through the cracks in history. Delia Derbyshire is still name-checked by bands like Orbital, Pulp and the Chemical Brothers. Adrian Utley of Portishead said that the Doctor Who theme tune is the single most important piece of electronic music. John Kavanagh at BBC Radio Scotland said that her influence can never be appreciated, as the edgy experimental music of Delia Derbyshire was pumped into the eager ears of tens of millions of school children during the 1960s and 70s. In the late 1980s, music technology caught up with what she had been doing in analogue terms in the 1960s. But more than that, Delia Derbyshire's music was stunningly beautiful. It took electronic music another 20 years to achieve that. Amazing Graces is an original radio documentary series about the forgotten women of history. The series is conceived and produced by Breach Brennan.